The second Caleb Walker's hand touched that restaurant door, his whole body went rigid because a stranger was about to say 4 words that ripped open a wound he'd spent 7 years sealing shut. "Your wife told me about you." Not hello. Not nice to meet you. His dead wife's name spoken by a woman he'd never met like Claire had reached across the grave to sit at that table. Tonight, watch a Navy father get pulled into his past and his future in the same breath. Before we start, comment the city you're watching from tonight, so I can see how far this story has traveled. And if stories like this move, you hit subscribe, there's more waiting for you. Chief Petty Officer Caleb Walker stood outside the restaurant with his hand frozen on the door handle, and for a man who had spent 18 years in the United States Navy, who had walked into engine rooms flooding with seawater, who had once carried an unconscious shipmate across a burning deck without so much as raising his heart rate, that single brass handle felt heavier than anything he had touched in his life. He pulled the door open anyway. That was who Caleb was. He didn't run from things. He never had. He walked straight into whatever was waiting for him, chin up, jaw tight, because that was what his father taught him. That was what the Navy had reinforced in him for nearly 2 decades, and that was the only way he knew how to survive. But nothing, not a single storm at sea, not a single deployment, not a single moment of combat had prepared him for the woman standing just inside that doorway. She was already looking at him, not glancing, not scanning the room the way strangers do when they're waiting on a blind date. She was looking directly at him, like she already knew exactly who he was, like she had studied a photograph of his face 100 times before tonight. "Caleb," she said. "That's me," he said, and he even managed something close to a smile, the kind he'd practiced in the bathroom mirror that morning while Sophie stood in the doorway, rolling her eyes at him. "I'm Maya," she said. She held out her hand. He shook it. Her palm was warm and a little unsteady, and for one brief second Caleb thought, okay, this is fine. This is just dinner. This is just 2 people trying to be brave for one night. Then Maya's expression changed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a gasp or a cry. It was something quieter and somehow far more devastating. Her eyes softened, her chin dropped slightly, and she looked at him, the way you look at someone you've been waiting a long time to finally meet. "I have to tell you something before we sit down," she said. "Because if I don't say it now, I don't think I'll be able to say it at all." Caleb's stomach tightened. "Okay." Maya took a breath. Her hands were trembling now, both of them, and she pressed them flat against her thighs like she was trying to steady herself before stepping off a ledge. "Your wife told me about you," she said. 4 words. Caleb didn't move. He didn't breathe. Somewhere behind him, a waiter dropped a fork, and the sound of metal hitting tile felt like it was happening in another room, another building, another life. "What did you just say?" His voice came out lower than he meant it to, rougher, like it had to fight its way up through 7 years of silence. "Claire," Maya said. "Her name was Claire, right?" The room tilted. Caleb had not said Claire's name out loud in front of a stranger in longer than he could remember. He didn't say it to the men in his unit. He didn't say it to the chaplain who'd checked in on him after the funeral. He barely said it to Sophie, not because he didn't want to, but because every time the word left his mouth it cracked something open in his chest that took days to close again. And this woman he had met 4 seconds ago, had just said it like it belonged to her too. "How do you know that name?" Caleb asked. His voice had dropped into the tone he used on duty flat, and controlled the tone that meant every muscle in his body was working overtime to keep him from falling apart in public. "How do you know my wife's name?" Maya's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. She looked like a woman who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times and still wasn't ready for it. "Can we sit down first?" she asked. "Please, I promise I'll explain everything. I don't think I can say this standing up." Caleb didn't answer right away. Every instinct in him, the sailor, the widower, the father, was screaming at him to turn around, walk back to his truck, and drive straight home, to the one part of his life that still made sense. His daughter asleep in her bed, safe, unaware that her father's careful, controlled world had just been split down the middle by a stranger's whisper. But he didn't leave. Because underneath the shock, underneath the confusion, there was something else clawing its way up in him, something he hadn't felt in 7 years. Hope. Or maybe it wasn't hope. Maybe it was just the desperate, aching need to hear his wife's name spoken by someone who wasn't him. "Fine," Caleb said. "We'll sit." They walked to the table in silence. Caleb pulled out Maya's chair without thinking, old habits, the kind Claire used to tease him about, and then lowered himself into the seat across from her, like his knees had suddenly forgotten how to work properly. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Caleb studied her face, searching for something familiar. Some clue, some reason his brain could accept for why a total stranger would know the name of a woman who had been dead for 7 years. He found nothing. Maya Bennett was, as far as he could tell, exactly who his friend had described. A schoolteacher, 34 years old. Kind eyes, a little nervous, a little guarded, the way people get when they've been hurt before and are trying not to show it. "I need you to start from the beginning," Caleb finally said. "Because right now I don't understand anything that's happening." Maya nodded slowly. "I know. I'm sorry. I know this isn't how any of this is supposed to go." "You think?" It came out sharper than he intended, and he immediately regretted it. But grief doesn't ask permission before it turns into anger, and Caleb had spent 7 years learning that the hard way. To her credit, Maya didn't flinch. "You're allowed to be angry," she said quietly. "If I were you, I'd probably already be walking out that door." "I thought about it," Caleb admitted. "I know," she said. "I could see it in your face." He let out a breath, long and slow, the kind of breath he used to take right before diving into black water during a training exercise, the kind of breath that meant brace yourself, because whatever comes next, you can't undo it. "Talk," he said. "Please." And so Maya began. Oh, 3 weeks earlier, Caleb had been standing in his kitchen at 6 in the morning, trying to convince his daughter that oatmeal was in fact a perfectly acceptable breakfast when his phone buzzed on the counter. It was Danny. Danny Reyes had served with Caleb for 9 years before retiring from the Navy and opening a small auto shop 2 towns over. He was loud, relentless, and the only man on earth who still had the nerve to tell Caleb Walker exactly what he didn't want to hear. "You up?" Danny's voice came through before Caleb even finished saying hello. "It's 6 a.m., Danny. Everyone with a kid is up." "Good. I got somebody I want you to meet." Caleb closed his eyes. "No." "You didn't even let me finish. You said, 'Somebody I want you to meet.' And my daughter is currently trying to hide oatmeal in the potted plant, so I don't have a lot of bandwidth for whatever this is." From across the kitchen, 8-year-old Sophie Walker, dark-haired, sharp-eyed, entirely too observant for a child her age, looked up from her bowl. "I heard that," she said. "You were supposed to eat it, not relocate it," Caleb said, pointing his coffee mug at the fern in the corner, which had in fact acquired a suspicious lump of oatmeal near its base. Sophie shrugged. The plant looked hungry. Danny's laugh crackled through the phone. "Man, that kid's gonna run the whole Navy someday. Look, I'm serious. Her name's Maya. She's a teacher. She's kind. She's normal. She doesn't have 3 ex-husbands buried in her backyard. And most importantly, Caleb. She's willing to have dinner with a man who hasn't been on a date in 7 years and still talks about his dead wife like she just stepped out of the room. I don't talk about Claire like that. You keep her toothbrush in the bathroom, man." Caleb didn't answer that one, because Danny was right, and both of them knew it. The toothbrush had been sitting in the same cup for 7 years. Faded blue bristles worn down, completely useless, and Caleb had never once been able to make himself throw it away. Every time he reached for it, every single time, his hand would stop an inch from the trash can, and some invisible weight would pull it back to the cup, back to its place beside his, like some small, stubborn part of him still believed that if he left it there long enough, she'd come back and need it. "Caleb?" Danny's voice softened, the teasing gone out of it now. "I'm not saying forget her. I would never say that to you. I'm saying Sophie needs to see her old man happy again. Not just functioning, happy. There's a difference, and you know it. I am functioning, Caleb said, and even to his own ears it sounded thin, like a report he'd filed too many times to still believe. You're surviving, Danny said. There's a difference between that, too. I watched you carry Claire's casket without shedding a single tear in front of anybody. And I watched you go back to work 3 days later like nothing happened. And I have kept my mouth shut about it for 7 years because I figured you needed the time. But 7 years, brother, that's not time anymore. That's a life sentence you handed yourself. Caleb pressed his palm flat against the kitchen counter, steadying himself against words he didn't have a comeback for because Danny wasn't wrong, and they both knew it. I don't even know how to start over, Caleb admitted quietly, turning away from Sophie so she wouldn't hear the crack in his voice. I don't know what that looks like. I don't know if I'm even allowed to want it. You're allowed, Danny said. You've been allowed this whole time. Nobody's been stopping you but you. Caleb glanced at his daughter, who had abandoned all pretense of eating, and was now watching him with the unblinking focus only children seem capable of. Is that your friend? She asked. The one trying to set you up on a date? Eavesdropping is rude, young lady. You're loud, she said simply. And yes, I think you should go. Caleb blinked. You think I should go? You cry sometimes, Sophie said so matter-of-factly that it knocked the breath clean out of him. At night. You think I don't hear it, but I do. I'm not a baby dad. The kitchen went very quiet. Caleb set his coffee mug down slowly because his hand had started to shake, and he didn't want his daughter to see that either. Sophie, I'm not saying it to make you feel bad, she said, sliding off her chair and walking over to wrap her small arms around his waist. I'm saying it because I want you to stop being sad by yourself. You don't have to. I'm right here. But maybe you need somebody who isn't 8. Caleb knelt down, so he was eye level with his daughter, the same way he had 100 times before at bedtime, after nightmares, after the day 2 years ago when she'd finally asked why her mother's picture didn't move like the ones on the videos. When did you get so smart? He asked, his voice thick. I've always been smart, Sophie said. You've just been too busy being sad to notice. That one landed harder than anything Danny could have said in 100 phone calls. That night, after Sophie was asleep, Caleb sat alone in the kitchen, with Danny's text still glowing on his phone screen. Her name is Maya Bennett. Dinner Friday, 7 p.m. Marchetti's on 5th. Don't overthink it, Chief. Just show up. Caleb didn't respond right away. Instead, he did what he always did. When the house got too quiet, he walked down the hallway and stood outside his daughter's door, listening to the soft, steady sound of her breathing. The one sound in the entire world that still made him feel like maybe somehow he was doing something right. Then, almost without deciding to, he walked into his own bedroom and opened the top drawer of his dresser. Inside, wrapped in a folded t-shirt Claire used to wear to bed, was a small stack of photographs. He didn't take them out often. He didn't need to. He had every single one memorized, the exact curve of Claire's smile in the one from their wedding day. The exhausted, radiant look on her face. The day Sophie was born, the last photo taken 4 months before she died, when neither of them yet knew how little time they had left. I don't know how to do this without you, Caleb whispered to an empty room, to a photograph, to a woman who couldn't hear him and never would again. I don't know how to let anybody else in. I don't even know if I'm allowed to. The house didn't answer. It never did. But somewhere in that silence, Caleb thought about Sophie's face at the kitchen table that morning. I want you to stop being sad by yourself. And something in his chest, something that had been clenched tight for 7 straight years, loosened by the smallest possible degree. He picked up his phone. He typed back 3 words to Danny Fine. I'll go. Then he put the photographs back in the drawer, closed it, and told himself it was just one dinner. Nothing more. He could survive one dinner. He had no idea how wrong that assumption would turn out to be. Friday arrived faster than Caleb wanted it to. He stood in front of his closet for 20 minutes trying to decide what a 36-year-old widowed Navy chief was supposed to wear on a first date in 7 years, before finally settling on a plain button-down shirt that Danny had once told him made him look like you're trying, but not trying too hard. Sophie sat cross-legged on his bed, supervising. "Not that one," she said the moment he pulled a gray shirt off the hanger. "You wear that one to funerals." "I do not." "You wore it to Grandpa's funeral." Caleb paused. She was right. He put the shirt back. "This is a lot of pressure for an 8-year-old to be handling," he said. "Somebody has to make sure you don't embarrass yourself." Sophie hopped off the bed and marched to his closet, pulling out the button-down without hesitation like she'd already decided on it days ago. "This one. Mom always said blue looked good on you." Caleb froze the shirt halfway to his hand. "You remember her saying that?" Sophie shrugged, but something flickered across her face, that particular kind of sadness that lived in children who had lost someone too young to properly grieve them, who carried fragments of memory like small precious stones they were terrified of losing. "A little. Mostly, I remember what you've told me. And the pictures. I like to pretend I remember more than I do." Caleb sat down on the edge of the bed and pulled his daughter into his side. "You don't have to pretend anything with me," he said. "Not ever." "I know," Sophie said. "But it makes me feel closer to her. Is that weird?" "No." Caleb said, his throat tight. "That's not weird at all. That's just love finding a way to stick around." They sat like that for a moment, father and daughter, in the quiet of a bedroom that still 7 years later held traces of a woman neither of them could bring back. Then Sophie sat up straight, wiped her eyes quickly with the back of her hand, and said in the brisk, business-like tone she used whenever she decided a moment had gone on long enough, "Okay, get dressed. You're gonna be late." Caleb laughed, actually laughed, a real one, surprising even himself, and did as he was told. 20 minutes later, dressed, hair-combed, keys in hand, Caleb stood in the doorway of the house, and Sophie stood in front of him, holding something small in her closed fist. "Before you go," she said. She opened her hand. Inside was a folded piece of paper, small enough to fit in a shirt pocket, the edges soft from being handled. "What's this?" "Don't open it now," Sophie said, pressing it into his hand and closing his fingers over it with both of hers, the way you'd close someone's hand around something fragile. "Don't open it until you really need it." "Need it for what?" "You'll know," Sophie said with the strange, quiet certainty children sometimes have that makes adults feel just for a moment like maybe the kids are the ones who understand the world better. "Just trust me." Caleb looked down at his daughter, at the small, serious face that had somehow, in the middle of losing her mother, learned how to hold her father together too, and he felt something crack open in his chest that had nothing to do with fear. "I love you. You know that," he said. "More than anything in this world." "I know," Sophie said. "Now go. You're gonna make Danny's friend think you stood her up, and then Danny's gonna call you for like an hour, and I have homework." Caleb laughed again, kissed the top of her head, tucked the folded note into his shirt pocket without a second thought, and walked out to his truck. He assumed it was a drawing, maybe a heart, maybe a stick figure family, the kind of thing Sophie had been making him since preschool. He didn't think much of it. He had no idea that folded piece of paper was about to become the most important thing in his pocket that night, more important even than the man carrying it realized. Batelier. The drive to the restaurant took 18 minutes, and Caleb spent every single one of them arguing with himself. "You don't have to do this. You could turn around right now. Nobody would blame you. Sophie would blame you. Sophie's 8. She doesn't get a vote. Sophie's the only reason you're still standing most days, and she just told you flat out to your face that she wants this. So what exactly are you so afraid of?" He didn't have a good answer for that last one. Not one he was ready to say out loud anyway. The truth. The real ugly, complicated truth was that Caleb wasn't afraid of Maya Bennett. He'd never met the woman. He had no reason to fear a stranger. What he was afraid of was what it would mean if the dinner went well, what it would mean if he laughed at something she said, if he felt even a flicker of the thing he used to feel with Claire, if some part of his heart, some traitorous, exhausted, lonely part of his heart, decided it wanted to try again. Because if that happened, if he let himself feel that, then he'd have to face the question that had been sitting in the back of his mind for 7 straight years, the one he never let himself finish asking. Am I allowed to be happy again, or does being happy mean I'm forgetting her? He didn't know the answer. He wasn't sure there was one. He parked outside Marchetti's with 11 minutes to spare, and instead of going inside, he sat in the driver's seat with both hands on the wheel, breathing the way he'd been trained to breathe during high-stress drills, in for 4 counts. Hold for 4, out for 4, until his heart rate settled into something manageable. Then he caught his own reflection in the rearview mirror, 36 years old. Steel gray eyes that used to hold more light in them, according to everyone who'd known him before Claire died. A jaw that hadn't fully unclenched in years. A man who had faced down flooding compartments and burning decks, and had somehow decided that a dinner reservation was the scariest thing he'd encountered in a decade. "Get it together, Chief," he muttered to himself. He got out of the truck. He walked toward the restaurant with his shoulders back and his chin up. The posture the Navy had drilled into him so deeply, it had become as automatic as breathing, especially when everything underneath that posture was shaking. He reached the door. And that's where we came in. Back at the table, Maya wrapped both hands around her water glass like it was the only steady thing left in the room and finally began to explain. 11 years ago, she said. I was 23. I just moved to a new city for my first real teaching job, and I didn't know a single soul. My apartment building had this little community room where they did potlucks sometimes, and I went to one because I was lonely, and I didn't know what else to do with a Saturday. Caleb listened, unmoving, his coffee going cold in front of him. There was a woman there, Maya continued. Older than me maybe by 10 years. She was sitting off to the side by herself, and honestly, I think she noticed I was struggling before I even said a word to her. She just came over, sat down next to me and said, "You look like someone who could use a friend tonight." Caleb's chest tightened. That sounded like Claire. That sounded exactly like Claire. Her name was Claire, Maya said, watching Caleb's face carefully. She didn't tell me her last name that night. It didn't come up. We just talked. For hours. About nothing really, about being new somewhere, about feeling invisible, about how hard it is to build a life from scratch when you don't have anyone in your corner yet. That's her, Caleb said quietly. That's exactly her. She used to do that, find the person standing alone at every party and go sit with them every single time without fail. I didn't know that then, Maya said, but I believe it now. She paused, and Caleb could see her gathering courage for whatever came next, the way you gather your legs underneath you before standing up after being knocked flat. I was going through something that year, Maya said carefully. Something hard. I'm not going to get into all of it tonight, but I will tell you it was the lowest point of my life, and I didn't have anybody. And your wife Claire, she didn't just talk to me that one night, she checked on me, she called, she showed up. For almost a year, she was the only person who made me feel like I mattered to somebody. Why didn't I know about you? Caleb asked. It wasn't accusatory. It was just confusion, raw and honest. Claire told me everything. Every friend, every coworker, every person she ever had coffee with. Why would she never once mention you? Maya's eyes filled again, and this time one tear slipped free, and she didn't bother wiping it away. Because I moved away before she ever met you, she said softly. We lost touch the way people do. Life happened. I got married, it fell apart. I moved twice more. I changed my number. Claire and I hadn't spoken in years by the time she... Maya stopped. By the time she... What? Caleb asked, though some cold, dreadful part of him already knew. Maya looked down at her hands. By the time she got sick, she said. I found out after, long after. A mutual friend mentioned it to me almost 2 years later completely by accident, and by then it was already... She didn't finish that sentence either. She didn't have to. Caleb sat back slowly in his chair, and for the first time since he'd walked through that door, he felt something other than fear or confusion. He felt the old familiar weight of grief settle back over him, heavy and total, the way it always did when he was reminded, as if he ever forgot, that the woman he loved was gone. And every story about her now, every single one, would always end the same way. I keep thinking there's a version of this conversation where none of it hurts, Caleb said, more to himself than to her, where I just get to hear her name and feel warm instead of gutted. 7 years, and I still haven't found that version. I don't think that version exists, Maya said gently. I think you just learn to carry both at the same time, the warmth and the ache. Claire talked about you like that too, actually, like loving somebody hard enough always came with a little bit of grief built into it, even before either of you had lost anything. Caleb looked at her sharply. She said that about me. She said a lot of things about you, Maya said. I didn't understand most of it back then. I do now. So how, Caleb said, slowly forcing the words out, does a woman my wife knew for less than a year over a decade ago end up sitting across from me on a blind date arranged by my best friend? Because I have to tell you, Maya, that is not a small coincidence. That is not something that just happens. Maya reached into her purse. Her hand was shaking so badly that Caleb heard the small clink of her keys against something else inside the bag before she finally pulled out what she was looking for. An envelope. Old. Worn soft at the corners, the way paper gets when it's been carried and refolded more times than anyone could count. The handwriting on the front stopped Caleb's heart cold. He would have known that handwriting anywhere. He'd seen it on grocery lists, on birthday cards, on the inside cover of Sophie's baby book, on love notes tucked into his sea bag, before every single deployment for 11 years of marriage. Is that? His voice broke on the word. He couldn't even finish the sentence. Maya nodded, tears falling freely now. It's from Claire, she said. She wrote it a few months before she passed. She mailed it to an old address, hoping it would somehow find its way to me. It took almost 3 years to actually reach me, forwarded twice, sitting in a box I didn't open for a long time, because I didn't recognize the return name, and I assumed it was junk mail. What does it say? Caleb asked. His hands were flat on the table now, pressing down hard, like he needed something solid to keep himself from coming apart completely in the middle of a crowded restaurant. I only opened it 8 months ago, Maya said. And when I did, Caleb, I need you to understand, I had no idea who you were when your friend set this up. Danny mentioned your name in passing weeks ago, and I didn't think anything of it, not until he said the words Navy widower and a daughter named Sophie. And something in the back of my mind just what? Just clicked, Maya said. Because your wife wrote your name in that letter, and your daughter's name, both of them. She wrote about you before I ever knew I'd meet you. Caleb stared at the envelope sitting on the table between them, inches from his hand, and he understood in that moment that his life had just split cleanly into 2 halves, the one before he walked through that restaurant door and whatever came next. I need to see it, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Please, I need to read what she wrote. Maya's hand hovered over the envelope, hesitant, like some part of her wasn't ready to let it go. Wasn't sure she had the right to hand a dead woman's final private words to the husband she'd left behind. Are you sure? She asked. Because once you read this, Caleb, I don't think you can unread it. I've carried this letter for 8 months trying to figure out how to give it to you, and every single time I lost my nerve. Tonight was supposed to be the night. I promised myself. But now that we're here, I'm terrified. Caleb reached across the table. His hand was steady. Now. Steadier than it had been all night. Steadier than it had felt in 7 long years. Because for the first time since he'd lost her, Claire was about to speak to him again, in her own words, in her own handwriting. And nothing on this earth, not fear, not grief, not 7 years of silence, was going to stop him from hearing what she had to say. I'm sure, he said. Maya slid the envelope across the table. Caleb looked down at his name, written in his dead wife's handwriting, and for a long moment he simply sat there with his fingers resting on the edge of the paper, unable to move, unable to breathe, caught in the strange, suspended space between the life he had learned to survive and the one he was about to discover he'd never truly finished losing. Somewhere in his shirt pocket, folded small and soft from being carried, was the note his daughter had pressed into his hand that evening, the one she told him not to open until he really needed it. Caleb didn't know it yet, but he was about to need it more than he had ever needed anything in his life. Caleb's thumb found the seam of the envelope, and for a moment his hand simply rested there, not moving, like some part of him needed permission from a version of himself that no longer existed. Then he broke the seal. Inside were two things. The first was a letter, several pages worn soft at every fold, clearly read and reread, more times than paper was ever meant to survive. Caleb recognized instantly that it wasn't written to him. The opening line alone told him that, "Dear Maya, I don't know if this letter will ever reach you, but I have to try." And he set it gently on the table without reading further, because some part of him understood immediately that those words belonged to someone else's grief, not his. But folded inside that letter, tucked so carefully it had nearly slipped free, when he opened the envelope, was a second, smaller piece of paper. Two words were written across the front in handwriting Caleb had memorized a lifetime ago. For Caleb, his breath left him in a way that had nothing to do with training, nothing to do with discipline, nothing to do with 18 years of learning how to control his own body under pressure. His hands, the same hands that had steadied under gunfire, that had held his newborn daughter without a single tremor, shook so badly that he had to set the paper down on the table twice before he could unfold it. "Take your time," Maya said quietly, and there was nothing rushed in her voice, nothing that asked anything of him. "I've had 8 months to prepare for this moment. You've had about 90 seconds. It's okay if you need longer." Caleb didn't answer. He couldn't. He unfolded the paper. Claire's handwriting filled the page, small and slanted the way it always leaned when she wrote quickly, when she wrote from somewhere urgent and unguarded. "Caleb, if you're reading this, it means the plan worked, or grief finally forced Maya's hand, or maybe you just got lucky, the way you always used to say we did. I don't know how much time has passed. I don't know if Sophie is still small enough to fit in your lap, or if she's already taller than you by the time somebody finally hands you this. I don't know what your life looks like right now. I only know one thing for certain, and it's the reason I'm writing this at all. I know you, Caleb Walker. I know you better than you know yourself, and I know exactly what you're doing right now, wherever now is. You've built a life around missing me instead of a life around living. You've turned our daughter into the only reason you get out of bed, and I love you for that, I do. But baby, that's not fair to either one of you. She needs a father who's alive, not a father who's just surviving on her behalf. I'm not writing to tell you to forget me. I would never ask that of you, and honestly, I don't think you could do it even if I begged. I'm writing to tell you the opposite. Loving me was never supposed to be a life sentence. It was supposed to be the thing that taught you how much you're capable of loving in the first place. Don't let it become the reason you stop. If you're holding this letter, someone brought it to you when you needed it most, which means some part of you was finally ready to hear it. So hear it, Caleb. Really hear it. You are allowed to be happy again. You are allowed to let someone else see the parts of you I got to see. You are allowed to fall in love again without it erasing a single second of what we had. Love isn't a pie, Caleb. There isn't a limited slice of it that gets smaller every time you give some away. It multiplies. It always multiplies. Sophie taught me that the second she was born, when I thought there was no possible way my heart could hold more than it already did for you, and then it just did. Let it multiply again. I love you. I will always love you. And that love does not require you to be alone for the rest of your life to prove it. Go live, sailor. Claire. Caleb read it twice. Then he read it a third time, because his eyes had blurred so badly on the second pass that half the words had swum together into something unreadable. He was aware distantly of Maya sitting across from him, of the low murmur of the restaurant around them, of a stranger's laughter 2 tables over, of the ordinary world, continuing on as if the entire axis of Caleb Walker's life hadn't just tilted permanently sideways. None of it felt real. The only real thing in the room was the paper in his hands and the woman's voice reaching him across 7 years. She wanted me to be happy, Caleb said, his voice cracking on the last word. The whole time. She knew exactly what I'd do to myself, and she wrote this before she even... He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Maya reached across the table, hesitated, then gently rested her hand over his. Not romantic, not forward, just steady, the way you'd hold someone's hand at the edge of something they were afraid to fall into. She loved you so much, she was planning for a future she wouldn't get to see, Maya said softly. I didn't understand what I was carrying when she asked me to keep this. I thought it was strange, honestly, a woman I'd only known a year asking me to hold on to something for a man I hadn't met and might never meet. But I understand it now. She wasn't asking a favor. She was leaving you a lifeline. Caleb pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes, trying and failing to keep himself together in a public restaurant on what was supposed to be a simple dinner. I don't know how to do what she's asking, he admitted. I've spent 7 years building a life where I don't have to feel any of this. And now I'm sitting here with her handwriting in my hands telling me to let it multiply, and I don't even know where to start. You don't have to know, Maya said. Nobody knows how to start. You just start. Caleb looked up at her, really looked at her, maybe for the first time since he'd walked through that door. Not as a stranger. Not as some inexplicable messenger from his dead wife's past. Just as a woman who had carried a letter for 8 months, terrified of the exact moment she was now living through because she understood better than almost anyone how much weight those 2 words for Caleb could hold. Why did you keep it this long? He asked. 8 months. Why not sooner? Maya was quiet for a moment, turning her water glass slowly on the table. Because I was scared, she said honestly. I kept telling myself I needed the right moment, the right way to reach out. But the truth is, I was terrified of what it would mean to hand a grieving man his dead wife's last words, and then just walk away. I didn't know how to do that without it destroying you. And then Danny mentioned your name, and I thought, maybe this is the moment. Maybe I'm not supposed to just mail it to you like a stranger. Maybe I'm supposed to actually be here when you read it. And now that you are, Caleb asked. Maya's eyes met his steady, despite the tears still sitting in them. Now I'm terrified for a completely different reason. Caleb didn't ask what she meant. He didn't need to. Something had shifted in the space between them over the last 20 minutes, something neither of them had planned for, and neither of them fully understood yet, and naming it out loud felt like it might scare it away entirely. Instead, he folded Claire's letter carefully along its original creases, the way you'd fold something you intended to keep for the rest of your life, and slid it into his shirt pocket, right alongside the note Sophie had pressed into his hand that evening, the one he still hadn't opened, the one his daughter had told him not to open until he really needed it. He thought briefly about opening it right there at the table. Something told him not to. Not yet. Some quiet instinct told him this wasn't the moment Sophie had been talking about, that whatever she'd written was meant for something further down the road, something he hadn't reached yet. He left it where it was. Tell me about her, Caleb said instead, meaning Maya, meaning the woman sitting across from him, whose entire life had somehow been quietly bound to his own for over a decade without either of them knowing it. Not about Claire, about you. Because right now, I know more about how you knew my wife than I know about who you actually are. Maya let out a breath that was almost a laugh, almost relief. That's fair. So talk, Caleb said, echoing the same word he'd used to invite her story 20 minutes earlier. Except this time, there was something gentler in it, something less like an order and more like an invitation. Maya told him. She told him about the marriage she'd walked away from 3 years into it, back when she was 26, after realizing slowly, and then all at once, that she had become smaller and smaller inside it, folding herself down until there was almost nothing of her left standing on her own 2 feet. She told him about moving into a studio apartment afterward that felt less like a home and more like a waiting room, a place she passed through on her way to somewhere else that never quite arrived. She told him about the year Claire had found her, the year she genuinely believed she might not make it through in one piece, and how one woman's insistence on checking in a phone call here, a coffee there, an unshakable refusal to let Maya disappear into herself, had been the thing that pulled her back into her own life. She never made it about her, Maya said. She never once made me feel like a project. She just showed up. Over and over, even when I gave her every reason to stop. That was her, Caleb said, and for the first time since he'd sat down, there was warmth in his voice instead of grief. She did that with everybody. Strays, she used to call them. Anybody who looked like they needed somebody in their corner, she'd just adopt them. I used to tease her about it. I bet she loved that, Maya said, a small smile breaking through. She did. She said someone had done it for her once, a long time before I met her, and she'd spent the rest of her life trying to pay it forward. Caleb shook his head slowly, something between a laugh and a sob caught in his throat. I can't believe I'm sitting here learning new things about my wife 7 years after I lost her. Is that a bad thing? Maya asked carefully. Caleb thought about it. Really? Thought about it. The way he thought about decisions that mattered, weighing it the way he'd weigh a call that could get a man killed if he got it wrong. No, he finally said. It's not a bad thing. It's the first good thing that's happened to me in longer than I want to admit. They talked for another hour after that. Not about grief. Not about letters or long-lost connections, or the strange, improbable thread that had pulled them into the same restaurant on the same night. They talked about ordinary things the school Maya taught 3rd grade at the ridiculous excuse a student had given her that week for a missing homework assignment, the fact that Caleb's daughter had once tried to convince her teacher that dogs could technically eat homework if you buttered it first. They talked about the Navy, about deployments, about the strange rhythm of a life spent constantly leaving and constantly coming back. They talked about nothing important, and somehow that nothing felt like the most important conversation Caleb had had in 7 years. When the check finally came, Caleb reached for it before Maya's hand had even left her lap. I've got it, he said. You don't have to do the whole gentleman thing, Maya said, though she was smiling when she said it. I know I don't have to, Caleb said. I want to. Outside in the parking lot, they stood by their cars a moment longer than either of them probably intended to, neither one quite ready to be the one who said goodnight first. I don't really know what happens after tonight, Caleb admitted. This wasn't exactly a normal first date. No, Maya agreed. It really wasn't. But I'd like there to be a second one, he said, and the words surprised him, even as he said them, because he hadn't planned to say them, hadn't rehearsed them the way he'd rehearsed almost every other sentence that night. They just came out honest and unguarded the way words used to come out of him, before grief had taught him to measure every single one before he let it loose. Maya's smile reached her eyes this time. I'd like that too. They exchanged numbers, standing in that parking lot, and when Caleb finally drove away, Claire's letter still folded in his shirt pocket. Sophie's note still unopened beside it. He found himself gripping the steering wheel, not out of fear this time, but out of something closer to disbelief. Something closer to the strange, unfamiliar sensation of a door creaking open after 7 years of being sealed shut. He didn't go straight home. Instead, he drove to the small overlook above the harbor where he used to take Claire when they were newly married, and neither of them could afford a real date night. And he sat there in his truck with the engine off, staring out at the water, reading his wife's letter for a 4th time, and then a 5th, until the words had settled somewhere permanent inside him, instead of just sitting on the surface of his shock. Go live, sailor. He laughed out loud alone in that truck, a broken, disbelieving laugh that turned into something closer to crying before he even realized it had shifted. Only Claire would have signed off a letter like that. Only Claire would have found a way to give him an order from beyond the grave and make it sound like a dare. Aye. He whispered to the water, to the dark, to a woman who would never hear him say it. Aye, Claire. By the time he finally turned the key and pulled back onto the road toward home, something in his chest had loosened for the first time in longer than he could remember. The babysitter, Danny's wife, Renata, who had watched Sophie plenty of times before, met him at the door with a knowing look on her face. Well, she asked. You're smiling. That's a good sign, right? It's complicated, Caleb said, which was without question the greatest understatement he had spoken in 7 years. He checked on Sophie before Renata left, standing in the doorway of her room the way he always did, watching the steady rise and fall of her breathing in the dim light from the hallway. She was curled around the same stuffed elephant she'd slept with since she was 2. The one with the ear Claire had sewn back on twice before she died, and Caleb had sewn back on once badly after that. He didn't wake her. He didn't need to. He just stood there a long moment, letting the weight of the night settle into something he could carry, and then he went to bed himself. Claire's letter still in his pocket, unwilling even now to put it down somewhere it might get lost. The next morning, Sophie was already at the kitchen table when he came downstairs, swinging her legs, watching him with an intensity that made it very clear she had been waiting. "So," she said, before he'd even reached the coffee pot. "So what? So how was it you were gone forever? I fell asleep before you even got home." Caleb poured his coffee, slowly buying himself a few seconds to decide how much of the truth an 8-year-old could carry. Not all of it, he decided. Not yet. But not nothing either. Sophie had earned more than nothing. "It was good," he said, sitting down across from her. "Really good, actually. Good, like you'll see her again. Good or good, like you're just being nice. Good like I already gave her my number and I'm planning on seeing her again," Caleb admitted. Sophie's whole face lit up bright and unguarded in a way that hit Caleb square in the chest. "I knew it. I told you. I told you you should go." "You did tell me that. So, are you going to tell me about her? What's she like? Is she nice? Does she like dogs?" "We don't have a dog, but if she likes dogs, that's a good sign for later." "Sophie." "What?" Caleb hesitated. This was the part he hadn't planned for, hadn't rehearsed on the drive home, or during that long hour parked above the harbor. But looking at his daughter's face so full of hope, so desperate for good news, after years of watching her father carry a weight she was too young to fully name, he decided she deserved honesty. Even if it was honesty scaled down to a size she could hold. "There's something else," he said slowly. "Something about last night that's a little hard to explain." "Okay?" Sophie said, suddenly serious, the way she always got when she sensed something important coming. "The woman I had dinner with. Maya. It turns out she knew your mom. A long time ago, before your mom and I even met." Sophie's eyes went wide. "Mom really? Really? And your mom left her a letter a long time before she got sick, and last night Maya gave it to me. There was a part of it written just for me." "What did it say?" Caleb reached into his shirt pocket where the letter had spent the entire night and set it gently on the table, though he didn't open it again. He didn't need to. He already knew every word of it by heart. "It said she wanted me to be happy," he said, his voice rough. "It said I'm allowed to love someone else without it meaning I loved her any less." Sophie was quiet for a long moment, staring at the folded paper on the table, like it might do something unexpected if she looked away. "That sounds like Mom," she finally said. "From what you've told me, she always wanted everybody to be okay. Even before she was sick, right? You said she used to give her lunch away at school if somebody forgot theirs." "She did do that," Caleb said, surprised, and not for the first time by how much his daughter had absorbed from years of bedtime stories about a mother she barely remembered. "So maybe you should listen to her," Sophie said, with the same simple, devastating logic she'd used the morning before, the logic that had somehow convinced a man who'd survived combat to walk into a restaurant terrified out of his mind. She was usually right about stuff. Caleb reached across the table and pulled his daughter into a hug so tight she squeaked in protest, though she didn't pull away. "When did you get so wise?" he asked into her hair. "I told you," Sophie said, muffled against his shoulder. "I've always been smart. You've just been too busy being sad to notice." He was still smiling about it hours later when his phone rang again, Danny unable apparently to wait a single hour longer for details. "Well," he demanded before Caleb had even said hello. "Don't leave me hanging, Chief. How'd it go?" Caleb sat down heavily on his back porch steps, phone pressed to his ear, and told him everything: the restaurant. The 4 words that had stopped his heart. The letter, the years-old friendship between Claire and a woman neither of them had ever heard of. The way the whole evening had felt less like a first date and more like being handed a message he'd been waiting 7 years to receive. For a long moment, Danny didn't say anything at all. "Danny. You there?" "Yeah?" Danny said, his voice thick in a way Caleb had rarely heard from him. "Yeah, I'm here. I set you up thinking I was doing a nice thing for a lonely friend. I didn't know I was handing you a letter from your dead wife." "Neither did I," Caleb said. "You okay?" Caleb considered the question honestly, maybe for the first time in years, actually stopping to check in with himself instead of reflexively saying fine and moving on. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But I think I might be eventually. For the first time in a long time, I actually think that might be true." "That's the most Claire thing I've ever heard," Danny said, and Caleb could hear the smile creeping back into his friend's voice. "Even dead 7 years, that woman's still out here fixing your life." "Don't," Caleb warned, though there was no real heat in it. "I'm serious. She probably planned this whole thing from wherever she is right now. Probably high-fiving somebody as we speak." Caleb laughed, actually laughed, the sound surprising him even as it left his chest. "Maybe she did." "So what now?" "Now," Caleb said, looking out over his backyard, over the swing set Claire had insisted on buying before Sophie was even born, over the small, ordinary life he had built out of survival and routine for 7 long years. "Now, I guess I try to actually live it. Like she asked me to." That promise turned out to be easier to make than to keep, but he meant it. And in the weeks that followed, life began to move differently than it had in longer than Caleb could remember. He and Maya talked nearly every day, texts in the morning before Sophie woke up, phone calls in the evening after she went to bed. The kind of easy, unhurried conversation that didn't need to justify itself or lead anywhere in particular. They met for coffee twice, careful, unrushed meetings, where neither of them pushed the other toward anything they weren't ready for. Caleb found himself more than once laughing out loud at something Maya said, a sound that still felt foreign in his own throat, like a muscle he'd forgotten how to use properly. At their second coffee meeting, sitting across from each other at a small table by the window, Maya set her cup down and studied him for a moment before speaking. "Can I ask you something, and you don't have to answer if it's too much?" "Go ahead," Caleb said. "Do you feel guilty right now, sitting here with me?" Caleb turned the question over honestly before answering the way he'd learned to weigh things that mattered. "Some days," he admitted. "Not because of you. Because some part of me still expects to be punished for feeling okay. Like happiness is a debt I haven't finished paying off yet." "That sounds exhausting," Maya said quietly. "It is," Caleb said. "But it's quieter than it used to be. Some days I barely hear it at all anymore." "What changed?" "You did," Caleb said, and then, almost embarrassed by his own honesty, added, "And the letter. Mostly the letter. But you too." Maya reached across the table and squeezed his hand once briefly, before letting go, and neither of them said anything else about it, because some things didn't need more words layered on top of them to be understood. He read Claire's letter often during those weeks, not out of grief this time, but almost like a compass, something to check himself against whenever the old guilt crept back in, whenever some quiet voice in the back of his mind asked him what right he had to feel this way about someone new. Go live sailor. It became something close to a mantra. 3 weeks after that first dinner, Caleb finally decided it was time for Sophie to meet Maya properly, not as an idea, not as a name attached to a story about her mother, but as an actual person sitting across the kitchen table. He was more nervous walking Maya through his front door that Saturday afternoon than he had been walking into the restaurant 3 weeks earlier. Sophie, for her part, treated the entire meeting like an interrogation she had clearly been preparing for. "Do you like dogs?" was the first thing out of her mouth before Maya had even fully crossed the threshold. "Sophie," Caleb warned. "It's fine," Maya said, laughing, crouching down slightly to be closer to Sophie's eye level. "I love dogs. I don't have one right now, but I grew up with a golden retriever named Biscuit, who used to steal socks out of the laundry basket and hide them under the porch." Sophie considered this seriously, the way she considered most things. "That's a good answer. Was that a test?" "Everything's a test today," Caleb muttered, earning himself a sharp look from his daughter. "What's your favorite color?" Sophie continued, undeterred. "Green. like a forest, not like a lime. Do you know how to braid hair? Because Dad's bad at it. He does this one braid and it always ends up crooked on one side. I heard that, Caleb said. I do know how to braid hair. Maya said, biting back a smile. I could show you sometime if you want. Sophie's face lit up in a way that made Caleb's chest ache with something that felt suspiciously like relief. Okay, Sophie said, apparently satisfied at least for the moment. You can stay for dinner. It wasn't a question. It was a verdict delivered with all the gravity an 8-year-old could muster, and Caleb watched Maya accept it with the same warmth she seemed to bring to everything. No forced enthusiasm, no performance, just quiet, genuine ease. Later that evening, after Maya had gone home and Sophie was brushing her teeth for bed, Caleb stood in the hallway outside the bathroom, listening to his daughter hum some half-remembered tune under the running water, and felt something settle in his chest that hadn't settled there in 7 years. Not happiness exactly. Not yet. But something close. Something that felt for the first time in longer than he could measure like the beginning of it. She's nice, Sophie said around a mouthful of toothpaste, catching him watching her in the mirror. Maya, I like her. Yeah? Caleb leaned against the doorframe. Me too. Do you think Mom would like her? The question landed soft but heavy the way Sophie's best questions always did, arriving without warning and demanding an honest answer. Caleb thought about the letter still folded in the top drawer of his dresser, about 4 words spoken in a restaurant that had cracked his whole life open, about a woman who had carried Claire's final wish for 8 months, terrified of the exact moment she'd finally lived through 3 weeks earlier. I think, Caleb said slowly, your mom's the reason I even met her at all. Sophie considered this with the same serious focus she brought to everything. Then nodded once decisively, like a small commanding officer signing off on a plan. Good, she said. Then I think it's okay. Caleb tucked her into bed a few minutes later, pulling the blanket up to her chin, the way he had every night for 7 years, and stood in the doorway a moment longer than usual before turning off the hall light. Something had shifted in the house over the past few weeks. Something he couldn't have named a month earlier, a lightness that hadn't been there before, small and fragile, but real. He wasn't foolish enough to think it would stay that simple forever. Nothing in his life ever had. But for one ordinary Tuesday night, he let himself believe it might. That fragile lightness held for weeks, carrying them both through ordinary days that no longer felt quite so heavy, until one evening, Maya called sounding different than she had on any of their previous calls, quieter, more careful, like she was choosing each word before she let it out of her mouth. Can we talk? She asked. In person, I mean. There's something I should have told you a while ago, and I think I've run out of good reasons to keep putting it off. Caleb felt something tighten in his chest, an old familiar instinct from years of receiving calls that started exactly this way. Is everything okay? It's not bad, Maya said quickly. I don't think it's bad anyway. It's just bigger than I've let on. There's more to Claire's letter than what I gave you that night. More than one letter, actually. I've just been trying to figure out how to tell you without it feeling like I was hiding something from you, even though I swear that was never my intention. Caleb sat down slowly at his kitchen table, one hand pressed flat against the wood, steadying himself against a conversation he hadn't seen coming. More letters, he repeated. More letters, Maya confirmed. One of them isn't for you at all, Caleb. Then who's it for? Maya was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Caleb could hear his own heartbeat in the silence. It's for Sophie, she said finally. Claire wrote your daughter a letter too, and I think it's time you both finally read it. Can we talk? She asked. In person, I mean. Caleb didn't sleep much that night. He lay in bed with the ceiling fan turning slow circles above him. Claire's letter still resting in the top drawer of his dresser, where he'd started keeping it, and he tried to imagine what his wife could have possibly written to an 8-year-old who would grow up mostly without her. He tried and failed. Every version he imagined felt too small for what Claire would have actually done. Maya came over the next evening after Sophie had gone down for the night and sat across from Caleb at the same kitchen table where he'd told his daughter about the first letter weeks earlier. This time she didn't reach into her purse right away. She folded her hands on the table and looked at him with an expression he was starting to recognize, the look of someone about to hand over something they'd been carrying far too long alone. "Before I give you the letter," Maya said, "I need to tell you what Claire actually asked of me, because I don't think you understand yet how far she planned this out, and I think you deserve to know before you read anything else." "Okay," Caleb said. Maya took a breath. The letter she wrote to me, the one addressed Dear Maya, it wasn't just her telling me about her life or catching up after years apart. It was a request, a specific one. She asked me to hold on to two things: your letter, which I gave you 3 weeks ago, and Sophie's, which I still have. And she asked me to wait. "Wait for what?" "For you to be ready to move forward," Maya said. She didn't know how long that would take. She guessed it might be years. She was right about that part too. But she said, "And I'm going to try to get this close to word for word because I've read it enough times that I think I can," she said. "I don't know who you'll be when the timing is finally right, but I trust that you'll know it when you see it. Watch for a man who stopped living without realizing it. Watch for a little girl who's had to grow up faster than she should have. And when you find the moment, give them what I couldn't stay to give them myself." Caleb sat perfectly still, absorbing that. "She trusted a stranger with the rest of my life," he said finally, his voice hollow with disbelief. "She trusted a woman she barely knew to decide when I was ready to move on." "I don't think she saw it that way," Maya said gently. "I think she saw it as insurance, a backup plan in case you never let anyone close enough to hand it to you any other way. She wasn't trying to control your life, Caleb. I think she was trying to make sure you didn't spend the rest of it alone by accident just because grief kept you from asking for help." Caleb pressed both hands against his face elbows on the table and stayed like that for a long moment. "How did you know?" he asked, finally looking up. "How did you know I was ready? What made you decide now was the moment?" Maya considered the question carefully before answering. "Honestly, I didn't know for certain," she admitted. "I've carried this responsibility for 8 months, terrified of getting it wrong in either direction, giving it to you too soon, and breaking something that wasn't ready to be touched, or waiting too long and missing the window entirely. But then Danny described you to me before we ever met. He said you were a good man who'd forgotten how to let anyone see him struggle. He said Sophie was the only thing keeping the lights on in your house some nights. And something about the way he said it, it just felt like the moment Claire had described. A man who'd stopped living without realizing it. You took a hell of a risk," Caleb said. "What if you'd been wrong? Then I would have handed you a letter that broke you instead of helped you," Maya said quietly. "I thought about that every single day for 8 months. I still think about it. But I also thought about what it would mean to keep carrying it forever, too afraid to ever give it to you at all. At some point, holding on to something that isn't yours becomes its own kind of failure." Caleb reached across the table, and for the second time since they'd met, took her hand. Not out of grief this time, not out of shock, but out of something that felt for the first time like genuine gratitude. "Thank you," he said, "for being brave enough to be wrong if you had to be." Maya's eyes glistened, but she smiled through it. "I really hoped I wouldn't have to find out." They sat with that for a moment, before Maya finally reached into her bag and pulled out a second envelope, smaller than the first, the front of it written in the same careful slanted hand. "For my Sophie." Caleb stared at it like it might disappear if he looked away. "Have you read it?" he asked. "No," Maya said. "That one was never mine to read. I only know what Claire told me was inside it in general terms. She wanted Sophie to know certain things about her in case she grew up without enough memories of her own. She wanted her to know she was loved before she was born, not just after." Caleb's throat tightened so hard he could barely speak. "I don't know how to give this to her," he admitted. "I don't know what it's going to do to her. She's 8, Maya. She's still a kid. I don't want this to break something in her that I can't put back together." "You won't be doing it alone," Maya said. Whenever you decide the time is right, I don't have to be there if you don't want me to be. But I don't think you should read it to her alone either. Not because you're not capable. Because nobody should have to carry something this big by themselves, and you've been doing exactly that for 7 years. Caleb looked down at the envelope in his hands, at his daughter's name written in a dead woman's handwriting, and thought about every night he'd stood in Sophie's doorway, listening to her breathe, wondering if he was failing her by trying to protect her from a grief he'd never fully processed himself. "Will you stay?" he asked. "When I give it to her, will you be there?" "If that's what you want," Maya said. Yes, of course. They decided on a Saturday morning, the kind of ordinary weekend morning that Sophie had come to associate with pancakes and cartoons rather than anything momentous, and Caleb spent most of Friday night rehearsing words that never sounded right no matter how many times he arranged them in his head. When Saturday came, he sat Sophie down at the kitchen table, Maya beside him, and set the envelope down in the middle of the table, the way you'd set down something fragile. Sophie looked at it, then at her father's face, and some old instinct in her, the same instinct that had let her hear him crying through walls for years, told her immediately that this wasn't an ordinary morning. "What is it?" she asked, quieter than usual. "Remember I told you your mom left a letter," Caleb said carefully. "One for me." "Well, it turns out she left one for you, too." Sophie's eyes went wide, then filled almost instantly, the way a child's grief moves faster and more honestly than an adult's, without any of the walls grown people build to slow it down. "For me?" she whispered. "For you," Caleb confirmed. "She wrote it before you were even old enough to remember her writing anything. She wanted you to have it whenever the time was right. Can I open it? Do you want to?" Sophie nodded, small and fierce, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand, the way she always did when she was trying not to cry, and failing anyway. Caleb slid the envelope toward her, and Sophie's small fingers, still slightly clumsy, the way 8-year-old fingers are, worked the flap open with a care that made Caleb's chest ache. Inside was a single folded page. "Do you want me to read it, or do you want to read it yourself?" Caleb asked. "Together," Sophie said. "I want you to read it with me." So they did. Caleb pulled his chair close enough that Sophie could see the page too, and he began to read out loud, his voice cracking almost immediately on the first line. "My sweet Sophie, if you're reading this, you're probably old enough now to understand at least some of what I want to tell you. And I hope more than anything that your dad found the right moment to give this to you. Not too soon, not too late, but exactly when you needed it. The way he's always been good at knowing what you need, even when he doesn't know how he knows it. I want you to know something that I don't think anybody can tell you as well as I can, because I'm the one who felt it happen. From the very first moment I found out you existed, before I ever met you, before I ever held you. I loved you so much, it scared me. I used to lie awake at night, with my hand on my stomach, just talking to you, telling you about the world you were about to be born into, promising you that no matter what happened, you would always, always be loved completely. I'm sorry I couldn't stay to keep that promise the way I wanted to. I'm sorry I don't get to see you grow up to watch you become whoever incredible person you're turning into right now as you read this. I'm sorry for every birthday I'll miss, every scraped knee. I won't be there to kiss better, every heartbreak and triumph and ordinary Tuesday I don't get to witness firsthand. But I need you to know that missing all of that doesn't mean I'm not still your mother in every way that counts. I am. I always will be. Love doesn't stop just because a person does. Here's what I most want you to understand, Sophie. Your dad is the best man I have ever known. He is going to spend a long time being sad about losing me, probably longer than either of us would want, because that's who he is. He loves hard, and he grieves just as hard. If you're reading this letter, it likely means someone finally helped him find his way back to living again. And if that's true, I need you to do something for me. I need you to let that be okay. I need you to let your dad be happy, even if it feels strange at first, even if some small part of you thinks loving someone new somehow means loving me less. It doesn't work that way, sweetheart. I promise you it doesn't. Your heart is going to keep growing bigger, your whole life big enough to hold every person who deserves to be in it, without ever making room by pushing anyone else out. Be kind to whoever helped bring your dad back to life. Whoever they are, they gave you something I couldn't give you myself. A father who isn't just surviving for your sake, but one who's actually living, laughing present whole. That is the greatest gift anyone could ever give either of you, and it deserves your gratitude, not your guard. I love you more than every star in every sky combined. I loved you before I met you, and I will love you after I'm gone in every quiet moment when you feel someone watching over you and can't quite explain why. Grow up brave, baby girl. Grow up kind, and take care of your father. He's going to need you exactly as much as you need him, maybe more. All my love, always, Mom. Caleb's voice had given out completely by the last two lines, and it was Sophie, tears streaming freely down her face, who finished reading them herself. Her small finger tracing the words like she was trying to memorize the shape of her mother's handwriting, along with the meaning underneath it. For a long moment, nobody said anything at all. Then Sophie folded herself into her father's chest, sobbing in the way children sob when grief finally catches up to something they've been holding at arm's length for years. And Caleb wrapped both arms around her, holding on like he was afraid she might slip away if he loosened his grip even slightly. "She loved me," Sophie said into his shirt, muffled and broken. "She really, really loved me." "She did," Caleb said, his own voice unsteady. "She loved you more than anything in this world. More than anything." "I don't remember her voice anymore." Sophie confessed, the words tumbling out between sobs like she'd been holding them back for a long time, waiting for a safe enough moment to finally say them out loud. "I try sometimes at night and I can't hear it anymore. I used to be able to when I was little. Now I can't, and it makes me feel like I'm losing her all over again." Caleb held his daughter tighter, his own tears falling freely now, unashamed, unguarded. 7 years of careful control finally cracking open completely in his own kitchen. "You didn't lose her," he said. "I promise you didn't. You just have to hear her a different way now. Through stories, through pictures, through letters like this one. She's still here, Soph. She's just quieter now. But she's not gone. Not from us. Never from us." Maya sat quietly through all of it, not intruding, not trying to insert herself into a moment that belonged entirely to father and daughter, until Sophie, still wrapped in Caleb's arms, turned her tear-streaked face toward her. "Thank you for bringing it to us," Sophie said, hiccuping slightly around the words. "For keeping it safe all this time." "It was the most important thing I've ever carried," Maya said, her own eyes wet. "I'm just glad I finally got to put it down in the right hands." Sophie extracted herself from Caleb's chest, just enough to look between the two adults, something calculating and 8 years old, moving behind her red-rimmed eyes. "Mom said to be kind to whoever helped Dad come back to life," she said slowly, like she was working out a puzzle out loud. "That's you, isn't it?" Maya glanced at Caleb, uncertain, before answering carefully. "I hope so. I hope I've helped anyway." Sophie nodded, decisive again, despite the tears still drying on her cheeks, and reached out to take Maya's hand across the table, a small, deliberate gesture that landed with more weight than either adult expected. "Then I'm glad you're here," Sophie said simply. "Mom would want me to say that, so I'm saying it." Caleb watched his daughter, this small, fierce, impossibly wise child, who had somehow absorbed more grace in 8 years than most adults managed in a lifetime, and felt something in his chest give way completely, not breaking, but finally, mercifully releasing. For the first time in 7 years, Chief Petty Officer Caleb Walker allowed himself to fully fall apart in front of the people he loved, without shame, without apology, without the armor he'd worn every single day since he'd buried his wife. And somehow, on the other side of that collapse, he didn't feel destroyed. He felt for the first time in longer than he could remember like he was finally standing on solid ground. That solid ground held for weeks afterward, good weeks that felt to Caleb almost dangerously easy. The kind of ease he'd forgotten how to trust, because for 7 years, ease had always been the thing that preceded loss. Maya became a regular presence in the house without either of them ever formally deciding it should be that way. She showed up for Sunday pancakes. She taught Sophie the promised braid, a French plait that came out straight and even, and Sophie wore her hair that way for a week straight, showing it off to anyone who'd stand still long enough to look. Caleb caught himself laughing more in a month than he had in the previous 3 years combined, and every time it happened, some small, quiet part of him checked in with himself, waiting for the guilt to arrive. One Saturday, the three of them drove out to the harbor overlook, where Caleb used to take Claire, and where he'd sat alone, reading her letter for the 5th time, the night everything changed. He hadn't planned on bringing them there. It just happened the way a lot of things had started happening lately, without him fully deciding them in advance. Sophie ran ahead down the path while Maya walked beside him quiet, letting him have the moment without asking him to explain it. "I used to come here with Claire," he said, eventually watching his daughter chase something invisible near the water's edge. "Back when we were young and broke, and this was the only date we could afford." "Do you want to be here alone?" Maya asked. "I can take Sophie back to the car." "No," Caleb said, surprising himself with how quickly the answer came. "I want you here. That's actually the whole reason I drove here without thinking about it. I think some part of me wanted you to see this place. Wanted it to mean something with you here too, instead of just being a place I go to grieve by myself." Maya slipped her hand into his, and they stood like that, watching Sophie skip stones badly across the water, and for a long moment, nothing in Caleb's chest hurt at all. It came sometimes, less than it used to. He was standing in the kitchen one evening watching Maya help Sophie with a school project spread across the table glue and glitter and construction paper, everywhere, both of them laughing at something Sophie had said when his phone rang. The caller ID read Naval Base Command. Caleb's stomach dropped before he even answered the old automatic response of 18 years spent waiting for exactly this kind of call. "Walker," he answered, stepping out onto the back porch out of earshot, some instinct telling him this wasn't a conversation for the kitchen. "Chief Walker, this is Lieutenant Commander Ortiz. I'm calling to confirm your deployment orders came through this morning. 6 months effective the 15th of next month. You'll need to report for pre-deployment briefing Monday at 0800. Caleb closed his eyes, feeling the ground that had felt so solid just moments earlier shift beneath him. 6 months, he repeated. "That's correct, Chief. I know the timing isn't ideal, but the unit needs your specialization out there. You've handled longer before." "I have," Caleb said, because it was true, because he'd survived deployments twice this length before, back when survival was the only thing he had to manage. Back before there was a woman inside his kitchen teaching his daughter to braid her hair back. Before he'd finally started to feel like a whole person again, instead of a ghost going through the motions of a life. He thanked the lieutenant commander, ended the call, and stood on the back porch for a long moment, staring out at the same swing set Claire had insisted on buying before Sophie was even born, feeling something heavy and familiar settle back over his shoulders. When he came back inside, Maya took one look at his face and knew immediately that something had shifted. "What happened?" she asked, setting down the glue stick, all her attention suddenly on him. "I got my orders," Caleb said. 6 months. I leave next month." Sophie's head snapped up from her project glitter, forgotten her face already crumpling with the particular fear of a child who had learned far too young exactly how permanent goodbyes could sometimes turn out to be. 6 months. She repeated, her voice small. "Like when you went before Mom." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Caleb crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and knelt down in front of her chair, taking both of her hands in his. "Hey, look at me," he said gently. "This isn't the same. I promise you this isn't the same. You don't know that." Sophie said, tears already spilling over, fast and frightened, in a way that broke something new in Caleb's chest. A fear he hadn't fully accounted for, that his daughter's grief over her mother had quietly rewired her fear of every future goodbye into something far larger and more dangerous than an ordinary deployment. "Mom went to the doctor, and she never came home the same. What if you go on the ship and something happens? What if I lose you too?" Caleb pulled her into his arms, holding her the same way he had weeks earlier when she'd read her mother's letter for the first time, feeling the same fierce, desperate need to hold his daughter together with nothing but his own 2 arms. "I am coming home," he said, his voice fierce and certain, in a way he needed her to hear as much as he needed to believe it himself. "I have survived worse deployments than this one, Sophie. I have survived storms and fires and things I never told you about because you didn't need to carry them. I am not going anywhere. Do you hear me? I am coming home to you." "You can't promise that," Sophie whispered. "Nobody can promise that." And there it was, the terrible, honest truth that Caleb had spent years trying to shield his daughter from, the truth that no uniform, no training, no amount of careful planning could ever fully guarantee. He couldn't promise it. Nobody could. Claire hadn't been able to promise she'd survive a diagnosis either, and she hadn't. And now his 8-year-old daughter understood with a clarity no child should have to carry, that love came with no guarantees attached to it at all. "You're right," Caleb said quietly, because lying to her now in this moment would have been the worst kind of betrayal. "I can't promise it with certainty. Nobody can promise anybody that. But I can promise you I am going to do everything in my power to come back to you. I can promise you that every single day I'm gone, you are the reason I'm careful. The reason I follow every protocol. The reason I take no unnecessary risks. You have never once, not for a single second, been anything less than the most important thing in my life. That's not going to change because I have to leave for a while." Hey. Sophie cried into his shoulder for a long time after that, and Caleb let her, not rushing the moment, not trying to fix it faster than it needed to be fixed, just holding his daughter through a fear that had been building in her quietly for 7 long years, finally finding its way to the surface. When she finally quieted, exhausted, Caleb carried her to bed himself, tucking her in, the way he had 1,000 times before, and sat with her until her breathing evened out into sleep. He found Maya in the kitchen when he came back downstairs, sitting at the table, the abandoned school project still scattered across it, her hands folded in front of her, her expression careful and unreadable in a way that told Caleb she'd been thinking through something difficult while he was upstairs. "I heard some of that," Maya admitted quietly. "I'm sorry, I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. The walls just aren't that thick." "It's okay," Caleb said, sitting down heavily across from her. 6 months is a long time," Maya said carefully, and Caleb heard underneath the careful neutrality of her tone a question she wasn't quite ready to ask directly. "It is," he agreed. "What does that mean?" "For us, I mean. I don't want to make this about me when your daughter's upstairs terrified. But I think we both need to say it out loud eventually, so I'd rather say it now than let it sit there unspoken for a month." Caleb looked at her for a long moment, weighing the same question that had been circling in his own mind since he'd hung up the phone on the back porch. "I don't know," he admitted honestly. 6 months ago, I would have told you exactly what to expect from me because 6 months ago, I wasn't letting anybody close enough to disappoint. Now, I've got a woman in my kitchen who taught my daughter how to braid her hair, and a letter in my dresser drawer telling me I'm allowed to love again, and orders telling me I'm about to disappear for half a year, right when all of that finally started feeling real. "So what do you want to do?" Maya asked. Caleb thought about the letter. Go live sailor. He thought about Sophie upstairs, finally asleep after crying herself empty over a fear 7 years in the making. He thought about 18 years of deployments, of leaving, of coming home to smaller and smaller pieces of the life he'd left behind. And he thought for the first time about what it might mean to come home this time to something that had actually grown while he was gone, instead of something that had quietly withered in his absence. "I think," Caleb said slowly, feeling his way through a decision he hadn't fully made until the words were already leaving his mouth. "I have 2 choices in front of me right now. I can do what I've always done. Go quiet. Pull back. Protect myself and everyone around me from the possibility of loss by never letting anyone get close enough to feel it if something goes wrong. That's what I know how to do. I've had 7 years of practice." "Or," Maya asked, her voice barely above a whisper, "or I can trust this." Caleb said, gesturing between them at the kitchen, at the whole fragile, unfamiliar shape of the life he'd started building over the last 2 months. I can trust you. I can trust Sophie to be braver than I'm giving her credit for. I can go on this deployment as a man who has something worth coming home to, instead of a man who's just trying to survive until the next deployment gives him an excuse to keep hiding. Maya reached across the table and took his hand, her grip firm despite the uncertainty still written across her face. That sounds a lot harder than the first option, she said. It is, Caleb agreed. It's the hardest thing I've considered doing since I buried my wife. Then why choose it? Caleb thought about the letter folded in his dresser drawer upstairs, about handwriting. He'd know anywhere, about 4 words that had cracked his whole careful life open in a restaurant 3 months earlier. Because she asked me to, he said quietly, and because for the first time in 7 years, I actually want to. He called Danny the next morning, sitting on the same back porch steps where he'd sat months earlier, delivering an entirely different kind of news. Orders came through, Caleb said without preamble. 6 months. I leave the 15th. Danny was quiet on the other end for a moment. How's Sophie taking it? About how you'd expect. Better than she was last night, but she's scared. Really scared, Danny. I think this is the first time she's had to really face what deployment means since she was old enough to understand what happened to Claire. And Maya. Caleb looked out over the backyard, over the swing set, over the ordinary shape of a life that had grown so much fuller in 3 short months than it had in the 7 years before it. Scared too, I think, Caleb admitted. But she didn't run. I half expected her to, if I'm honest. 6 months is a lot to ask somebody to sign up for this early. But she just sat there and asked me what it meant for us, like it was a question worth staying around long enough to answer. That's a good sign, Chief. Yeah, Caleb said. It is. You gonna be okay? Leaving now of all times, right when things finally started looking up for you. Caleb thought about the question longer than he needed to, turning it over the way he'd learned to turn over everything that mattered since that night in the restaurant. I don't know, he said honestly. Part of me is terrified I'm going to come home and find out 6 months was too long. That everything I finally let myself build fell apart while I was gone. The way everything always used to fall apart when I left. But another part of me, a part I haven't heard from in a long time, thinks maybe this is different. Maybe I'm not leaving behind an empty house this time. Maybe for once, I'm leaving behind something worth fighting to come back to. Only one way to find out, Danny said quietly. Yeah, Caleb said, watching the morning light stretch slowly across the yard. Only one way to find out. The weeks between that phone call and the 15th moved faster than any of them wanted them to, the way time always seems to accelerate right when you most need it to slow down. Caleb spent his days running through the familiar rhythm of pre-deployment checklists, gear inspections, medical clearances, the long list of small practical tasks that came before every long trip overseas. But his evenings belonged entirely to Sophie and Maya, and he protected those hours with a fierceness he hadn't known he still had in him. They fell into a routine without ever discussing it out loud. Maya came over most nights, sometimes staying for dinner, sometimes just long enough to help Sophie with homework, while Caleb sorted through duffel bags in the next room, always within earshot of his daughter's voice, as if some part of him were trying to store up enough of the sound to last 6 months. You're going to run out of socks before you run out of worry, Maya told him one evening, watching him fold and refold the same stack of uniforms for the 3rd time. You've checked that bag more times than the actual Navy probably requires. Old habit, Caleb admitted, not looking up. Keeping my hands busy keeps the rest of me quiet. And is the rest of you quiet? Caleb set down the shirt he'd been folding and finally looked at her. No, he said honestly. The rest of me is loud as hell right now. I keep running the math. 6 months, 180 some days. That's a lot of dinners. I'm going to miss a lot of bedtimes, a lot of ordinary Tuesdays where nothing happens, except everything happens, because that's what being a parent actually is. You've done 6 months before, Maya said gently. I have, Caleb agreed. But I've never done it with something like this waiting for me at the other end of it. That's the part I don't know how to prepare for. Missing a deployment used to just mean missing my house. Now it means missing you too, and I don't have 18 years of training for that." Maya crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him from behind, resting her chin against his shoulder blade. And for a moment, neither of them said anything at all. "I'll be here," she said finally. "Every single day of it. I'm not going anywhere, Caleb." "You don't know that," he said, echoing, without meaning, to the exact words his daughter had thrown back at him weeks earlier. "Nobody can promise that. 6 months is a long time to ask somebody to wait around for a man who might come back different than he left." "I'm not asking to be promised anything," Maya said. "I'm choosing this. Every day I get to choose it again. That's different from a promise, and honestly, I think it's stronger than one." Caleb turned in her arms to face her, searching her expression for any hint of doubt, any flicker of the fear he half expected to eventually surface, the fear that had ended things before with other people in other circumstances. He found none of it. Just steadiness. The same steadiness she'd carried into that restaurant 3 months earlier, the same steadiness that had made her brave enough to hand a grieving man his dead wife's final words without knowing whether it would break him or save him. "How did I get lucky enough to find you?" he asked quietly. "You didn't find me," Maya said, a small, sad smile crossing her face. "Claire did. I just showed up when she told me to." Danny stopped by the house 2 nights before Caleb was due to report, ostensibly to help load gear into the truck, though both men knew the visit had less to do with logistics and more to do with the fact that Danny needed to say something before his best friend disappeared for 6 months. "You clean up good, Chief," Danny said, watching Caleb fold the last uniform into the duffel bag with the same precision he'd used for 18 years. "Never thought I'd see the day you actually had somebody worth coming home to besides that kid in there." "Watch it," Caleb said, though there was no heat in it. "I'm serious," Danny said, dropping the teasing for a moment, his voice going quieter. "I've known you almost 10 years, man. I watched you go dark after Claire. I mean really dark, the kind of dark I didn't know if you were going to climb back out of. And now look at you, packing a sea bag with a crayon drawing folded on top of your uniforms." "You looked through my bag. I wasn't snooping, it was sitting right there," Danny said, unbothered. "Point is, I set you up on one dinner thinking I was doing you a favor, and I ended up watching you come back to life. That's not something I take lightly, brother." Caleb zipped the bag shut and looked at his oldest friend, feeling something he didn't often let himself feel toward another man out loud. "Thank you," he said simply, "for not giving up on me, even when I gave you every reason to." "That's what shipmates are for," Danny said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Now get out of here before you make me say something even sappier. And call Renata when you get a satellite window. She'll want to check on Sophie for you while you're gone, whether you ask her to or not." "I will," Caleb said. "Thank you, Danny, for everything. Not just the setup, all of it." Danny just nodded, this kind of nod that carried more weight than words would have, and helped him carry the last bag out to the truck. Sophie handled the countdown to deployment with a bravery that both amazed and worried Caleb in equal measure. She stopped asking the fearful questions she'd asked the night the orders first came in, but Caleb noticed she'd started sleeping with her door open again, the way she had in the year right after Claire died, a small detail that told him more about what she was carrying than any conversation could have. He brought it up one night while he was tucking her in the duffel bags already packed and waiting by the front door for the morning. "You've had your door open again," he said carefully, sitting on the edge of her bed. "Every night this week." Sophie picked at the edge of her blanket, not quite meeting his eyes. "I like being able to hear the house," she said. "Just in case." "In case of what?" "In case something happens and I need to know right away," she admitted. "I used to sleep with it open after Mom, remember? I just started doing it again, without really deciding to." Caleb reached over and smoothed her hair back from her forehead, the way he used to when she was small enough to still fall asleep during the motion. "I need you to hear something from me, and I need you to really hear it, not just let it go in one ear and out the other," he said. "This deployment is dangerous the way every deployment is dangerous, but it's not the same kind of danger that took your mom." Nobody can promise you nothing bad will ever happen to anybody you love. Not me, not Maya, not anybody. That's just true, and I'm not going to lie to you and pretend it isn't. But I can tell you that I am careful. I am trained. I follow every protocol there is, and I have survived worse than this before you were even born." "I know," Sophie whispered. "I just get scared anyway, even when I know it." "That's allowed," Caleb said. "Being scared doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. It just means you love hard, same as your old man. We're a matched set that way." Sophie almost smiled at that, the ghost of it flickering across her face before the seriousness settled back in. "Will you call while you're gone? As much as you can. Every chance I get," Caleb promised. "And I'm going to write you letters too. Actual letters on paper the old-fashioned way, so you have something you can hold on to between calls." "Like Mom's letters," Sophie said quietly. Caleb's chest tightened at the comparison, but he didn't shy away from it. "Kind of like that," he agreed. "Except mine will just be about ordinary things. What the ship looks like, what I had for dinner. Boring dad stuff. Nothing you'll need to save for years and years before you're ready to read it." "I might save them anyway," Sophie said, "just in case." "Then I'll write extra." Caleb set his voice thick, "so you've got plenty to save." The morning of the 15th arrived gray and quiet, the kind of ordinary weather that felt almost insulting given the size of what was happening inside the house. Maya came early before the sun had fully cleared the trees, and the three of them sat together at the kitchen table. For what Caleb suspected, none of them were actually eating, just pushing eggs around plates, because sitting still with nothing to do felt somehow worse than pretending to be busy. When the time finally came to load the truck, Sophie disappeared upstairs for a moment, while Caleb carried the last duffel bag out to the driveway, and when she came back down, she was holding something small and folded, the same careful way she'd held the note 3 months earlier, the one still tucked unopened in the bottom of Caleb's sea bag where he'd kept it since the night of the restaurant. "This one you can open right now," Sophie said, holding it out to him. "This one's not a wait until you need it one." Caleb knelt down to take it, his hand steadier than he expected, though his eyes were already burning. He unfolded the paper. It was a drawing done in the careful, deliberate crayon strokes of a child who had clearly worked hard to get it exactly right. 3 figures standing together in front of a house holding hands, the sun drawn large and yellow in the corner, the way children always draw it, oversized and impossible to miss. Above the figures in Sophie's careful, still developing handwriting were the words, "Families can grow without forgetting." Caleb stared at it for a long moment, unable to speak. "I drew it a few weeks ago," Sophie said suddenly, a little shy, watching his face for a reaction. "After we read Mom's letter. I kept thinking about what she said about hearts getting bigger instead of smaller, and I wanted to draw it so I wouldn't forget what it looked like in my head." "Who are the 3 people?" Caleb asked, though some part of him already knew. "That's you, and that's me," Sophie said, pointing to 2 of the crayon figures. "And that's Maya. I know Mom's not in the picture, but she's still there. She's the sun. I made it big on purpose so you'd notice." Caleb's control, the careful, disciplined control he'd spent 18 years building and 7 years leaning on to survive an impossible loss, finally gave out completely in his own driveway, tears falling freely as he pulled his daughter into his arms. "I love it," he managed. "I love it so much, Sophie. I'm going to carry this with me every single day I'm gone." "You better," Sophie said, muffled against his shoulder, trying and failing to sound stern through her own tears. "Or I'm drawing you a worse one when you get back." Maya stood a few feet away, giving them the moment, her own eyes wet, and when Caleb finally straightened up, wiping his face with the back of his hand, he reached out and pulled her into the embrace too, all 3 of them standing together in the gray morning light, exactly the way the crayon drawing had promised they would. "I don't know how to say goodbye to this," Caleb admitted, his voice rough-looking between the 2 of them. "I've said goodbye 100 times in my life, and none of them ever felt like this." "Then don't say goodbye," Maya said. "Say see you later. That's what Claire would have wanted anyway. She hated goodbyes. Sophie told me that once." "She did hate them," Caleb said, surprised into something almost like a laugh through his tears. "She used to get mad at me for even using the word. said it sounded too final. So don't use it, Maya said simply. Caleb looked down at his daughter, then at Maya, then out at the truck, waiting in the driveway at the whole enormous, uncertain shape of the next 6 months stretching out in front of him. See you later, he said, instead testing the words, finding them somehow easier to carry than the alternative. Both of you. See you later, not goodbye. See you later. Sophie repeated, fierce and determined, like she was making it a promise instead of just a phrase. See you later. Maya echoed, quieter, but no less certain. He held on to both of them a moment longer than he probably should have, given the time, given the schedule, waiting for him at the base. And then he made himself let go, because the alternative was standing in that driveway forever, and forever wasn't an option any of them had. The ship felt different than Caleb remembered from previous deployments, though he suspected it wasn't the ship that had changed at all. It was him. He'd spent 18 years learning how to compartmentalize, how to fold his entire life into a small sealed box the moment he stepped aboard, and not open it again until he stepped off, because that was the only way to stay sharp, the only way to keep himself and his shipmates safe. He'd been good at it once, frighteningly good if he was honest with himself. Grief had made him even better at it. In a strange way, a man with nothing waiting for him at home had nothing to distract him from the job in front of him. Now the box wouldn't stay sealed no matter how hard he tried. He found himself thinking about Sophie's crayon drawing during watch, propped against the small mirror in his rack, the oversized yellow sun catching the light every time he walked past it. He found himself composing letters in his head, during long stretches of downtime, sentences he'd write out properly once he had paper, and a quiet moment describing the ocean, the routine, the small boring details of a life he wanted his daughter to feel included in, even from thousands of miles away. He called when he could, which wasn't often, satellite windows being what they were, but every call felt like surfacing for air after too long underwater. Sophie's voice on the other end, updating him on school, on a friend's birthday party, on a math test she'd nearly failed, and then through sheer stubbornness actually passed. Maya's voice after that, steady and warm, telling him about her school day, about a student's ridiculous excuse for a late assignment, about nothing important that somehow still felt like the most important thing he'd heard all week. The letters came too real. Paper letters, slower than calls but somehow more permanent, and Caleb read each one 3 or 4 times before folding it carefully into the small metal box he kept beside his rack. The same box he realized one night with a jolt that he'd once used to store letters from Claire during deployments a lifetime ago. He hadn't planned that. It had just happened, muscle memory reaching for a familiar shape without asking permission first. A younger sailor in his division, a kid barely 22 named Ruiz, who bunked 2 racks down, caught him looking at the crayon drawing one evening and asked about it the way young sailors sometimes did when they were homesick and looking for any excuse to talk about someone waiting for them. "That your daughter's?" Ruiz asked. "Yeah," Caleb said. "She drew it right before I left. Says the sun's supposed to be her mother." "That's rough, Chief. Sorry. It's not what you think," Caleb said, surprising himself with how easily the words came now, how little they cost him compared to a year ago. "My wife passed a while back. This is somebody new. My daughter drew all 3 of us together, and she made her mom the sun over the top of it, watching over things. 8 years old, and she figured out something it took me 7 years to understand." Ruiz was quiet for a moment, considering that. "My grandma used to say something like that the people we lose don't really leave, they just change shape, become something else. Weather, maybe. Light." "Your grandma sounds like she and my late wife would have gotten along," Caleb said, and meant it. It was on one of the harder nights, 6 weeks into the deployment, after a long grinding day that had worn him down in ways that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion, and everything to do with the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people and still feeling entirely alone, that Caleb finally reached for his sea bag and pulled out the note, the original one. Sophie's first note, folded small and soft from months of being carried, the one she'd pressed into his hand the night of the restaurant with instructions not to open it until he really needed it. He'd carried it through the entire ordeal with Maya. Through Claire's letter, through Sophie's letter, through the deployment orders and the goodbye in the driveway. Every time he'd thought maybe this was the moment, some quiet instinct had told him no, not yet, and he'd tucked it away again, trusting his daughter's strange, certain wisdom more than his own judgment. Tonight, sitting alone in his rack further from home than he'd ever felt, despite the ship's steady familiar rhythm around him, something told him the waiting was finally over. He unfolded it carefully. Sophie's handwriting filled the small page rounder and less developed than it was now, the handwriting of a girl who had been 8 years old and terrified and trying in the only way she knew how to give her father something to hold on to before he walked out the door toward a dinner that would change both their lives. Dear Daddy, I know you miss Mommy. I miss her too, even though I don't remember her as good as you do, but I don't want you to be sad forever. I heard you crying again last night, and I didn't come in because I didn't want you to know I heard, but I wanted to write this so you'd know it's okay. It's okay to be happy again, Daddy. I still love Mommy, and you can still love her too, and it's not going to make her go away more than she's already gone. I think loving somebody new just means your heart gets bigger, not that it forgets the old parts. I want you to smile again, like you do in the old pictures, the ones from before I was born. I've only seen you smile like that in pictures, and I want to see it for real someday. I love you to the moon and the ocean, and back further than the Navy ship goes even. I'll still love you no matter what happens tonight, whether it goes good or bad or weird. I just wanted you to have this, in case you needed somebody to tell you it's okay. Love. Sophie. Caleb sat with the letter in his hands for a long time, the ship humming quietly around him, and felt something settle into place that had been circling loosely inside him for months without ever quite landing. His 8-year-old daughter had written those words before any of it happened. Before Maya. Before the restaurant. Before Claire's letters, or the harbor overlook, or the crayon drawing with its oversized yellow sun. She had written them out of nothing but a child's fierce, uncomplicated love. Some instinct in her small chest telling her exactly what her father needed to hear, even though she had no way of knowing what was coming. Claire had written it, too, months before she died, planning years ahead with a foresight that still left Caleb breathless every time he thought about it. Two people who loved him most in the world, one gone and one still growing, had somehow arrived at the exact same truth independently without either of them knowing the other had said it first. You are allowed to be happy again. Caleb folded the letter back along its worn creases and placed it in the metal box beside his rack, next to Claire's letter, next to the growing stack of Sophie's newer letters, next to the crayon drawing with its impossible oversized sun. Then he picked up a pen and a blank sheet of paper, and for the first time since he'd boarded the ship 6 weeks earlier, he found the words came easily. No careful compartmentalizing, required no box to seal shut before he could function. Dear Sophie, he wrote, I finally opened your letter tonight. You were right. I needed it exactly when I needed it, not a day sooner. I want you to know I heard you crying that morning too. The one you mentioned when you didn't come in because you didn't want me to know you'd heard me. I think we spent a lot of years trying to protect each other from the same sadness, both of us crying quietly on opposite sides of a wall. Both of us thinking we were doing the other one a favor. I don't want us to do that anymore. Not the sad parts and not the happy parts either. I want us to just tell each other the truth from now on, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. You asked me once to smile like I do in the old pictures. I want you to know that somewhere out here on a ship in the middle of an ocean, you can't even see the edges of your old man finally did it. Not because everything is easy. It isn't. I miss you more than I know how to put into words that fit on one page. But I smiled tonight thinking about you and Maya, and that drawing with the sun too big for the sky, and it didn't feel like betraying anybody. It just felt like being alive. Your mom used to say, love multiplies instead of divides. I didn't understand that for a long time. I think I finally do. Take care of Maya while I'm gone. Take care of yourself. And save my letters if you want to, even the boring ones about what I had for dinner, because someday I think you'll be glad you did the same way. I'm glad I finally opened yours. I love you to the moon and the ocean and back. Further than this ship goes even. See you later, kiddo. Not goodbye. Love, Dad. He read it over, once, folded it carefully, and set it aside to mail at the next opportunity. Then he lay back in his rack, the metal box of letters within arm's reach, the ship's engines humming their steady, familiar rhythm beneath him. And for the first time in 6 weeks, sleep came easily, without the usual restless turning, without the old habit of bracing against a loneliness that had, for tonight at least, finally loosened its grip. Somewhere above him, through steel and ocean, and thousands of miles of dark water, he pictured his daughter asleep with her door open and a woman 2 towns over who had chosen him and kept choosing him one ordinary day at a time. He thought about a sun drawn too big for the sky on purpose, so nobody looking at it could ever forget it was there. He didn't know yet how the rest of the deployment would go. He didn't know what would be waiting for him when the ship finally turned back toward home. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, Caleb Walker fell asleep without bracing for what might go wrong, and that more than anything felt like the beginning of something he still didn't have a name for. The last 4 months of the deployment moved the way the first 6 weeks never had, not because the work got any lighter, but because Caleb had finally stopped treating every day as something to simply survive. He wrote Sophie a letter almost every week, sometimes 2 filling pages, with the kind of ordinary details he used to think weren't worth mentioning. The way the ocean changed color depending on the hour. A card game he'd taught a few of the younger sailors the ridiculous nickname his division had given him after he beat all of them at it 3 nights running. He called Maya whenever the satellite windows allowed, and their conversations stopped feeling like careful negotiations between 2 people testing whether something fragile could survive distance, and started feeling like exactly what they were. 2 people who had already decided without ever saying it outright that they were going to make this work. "You sound different," Maya told him during one of their calls somewhere around month 4. "Lighter." "I feel different," Caleb admitted. "I think I forgot somewhere along the way that deployments used to feel like this. Before Claire got sick. Before I turned every trip into something I just had to grind through until I could go back to being numb at home. And now, now I've got people worth being sharp for," Caleb said. "Worth being careful for. Worth coming home to instead of just returning to." Sophie's letters back were shorter, messier, full of the kind of updates only an 8-year-old closer to 9, now her birthday having come and gone while he was at sea. A fact that still sat heavy in his chest. Every time he thought about missing it, could deliver with total sincerity. A friend's birthday party. A spelling test she'd aced. A complaint about a substitute teacher who didn't understand that recess was in fact essential to human survival. And tucked into nearly every letter without fail, a small drawing in the corner of the page, the same 3 figures, the same oversized sun. Though the details shifted slightly each time, as if she were tracking in crayon how the family kept growing and changing while he was gone. He kept every single one in the metal box beside his rack until the box could barely close, until he had to fold the closing letters more tightly, just to make them fit. Danny called the ship once during a rare stretch when the satellite window lined up with a moment Caleb was actually free, and spent most of the call needling him about the engagement he hadn't proposed yet. "You gonna ask her the second you're back on dry land? Or are you gonna make the poor woman wait around wondering?" Danny asked. "I've got a plan," Caleb said. "You've had 6 months to come up with a plan. It better be a good one." "It's a good one," Caleb said, though he wouldn't say more than that. Not even to Danny, because some things he wanted to get exactly right, and he'd learned enough about himself over the last year to know that saying a plan out loud too early sometimes let the nerves talk him out of it. "Just don't overthink it, Chief," Danny said. "You've spent enough of your life overthinking the easy parts and not enough time trusting the good stuff when it's right in front of you. Don't do that again." Caleb thought about that conversation more than once in the weeks that followed, turning Danny's advice over the way he turned over most things that mattered, and by the time the ship finally set course for home, he'd stopped needing to think about it at all. He already knew what he wanted. He just had to say it out loud to the right person. The morning the ship finally turned toward home, Caleb stood on deck longer than he needed to, watching the horizon the way he used to watch it as a young sailor, back before loss had taught him to brace against everything good, the same way he braced against everything bad. This time, there was nothing to brace against. Just the plain, uncomplicated fact of going home to people who were waiting for him. Actually waiting, not just enduring his absence, the way a house endures an empty room. The pier was crowded the day the ship finally came in. Families pressed together in clusters, hand-lettered signs bobbing above the crowd, that particular electric mixture of relief and anticipation that Caleb had felt from both sides more times than he could count over 18 years. He scanned the faces methodically, the way he'd been trained to scan any crowd, until he found the two that mattered. Sophie saw him first. She broke away from Maya's hand and ran the second she spotted him coming down the gangway, weaving through the crowd with a speed that made Caleb's heart nearly stop for an entirely different reason than the ones he'd trained for, and he dropped his sea bag right there on the pier to catch her when she launched herself into his arms. "You're taller!" he said into her hair, laughing and crying at the same time, holding her so tight she squeaked in protest. "How did you get taller in 6 months?" "I told you I would," Sophie said, muffled against his shoulder. "I've been eating all my vegetables just to prove it." "Somehow I doubt that's the reason." "Don't ruin it," Sophie said, pulling back just far enough to look at his face, checking it the way she always did, cataloging every detail, like she needed to confirm he was really there, and not some elaborate trick her mind was playing on her. "You look tired." "I am tired," Caleb admitted. "Good tired, though, the kind that goes away." Maya reached them a moment later, hanging back slightly, giving father and daughter their reunion first. And when Caleb finally looked up and found her standing there, something in his chest that had been braced for 6 months released all at once. "Hi," she said simply. Her eyes bright with tears she wasn't bothering to hide. "Hi," Caleb said back, and then closed the distance between them. Sophie still wrapped around his side and pulled Maya into the embrace too. All three of them standing together on that crowded pier, exactly the way the crayon drawing had promised they would. Exactly the way they had stood in the driveway 6 months earlier. Except this time, there was no truck waiting to pull him away. "You kept your promise," Maya said against his shoulder. "You came home." "I told you I would," Caleb said. "I meant it." "I know you meant it," Maya said. "That doesn't mean I wasn't scared every single day anyway." "Me too," Caleb admitted. "Every single day." They stood like that for a long moment, the noise of the pier fading into something distant and unimportant, until Sophie never one to let a moment go on too long without her input tugged at his sleeve. "Can we go home now?" she asked. "I made you a sign and everything, but I dropped it running over here." Caleb laughed, the sound coming easy and unguarded, and picked his sea bag back up off the pier. "Yeah," he said. "Let's go home." The drive back felt different than every homecoming drive he could remember from the 18 years before it. Usually there had been a heaviness to it, even the good ones, some small part of him already dreading the empty silence of the house waiting at the end of the road. This time, Sophie talked the entire way, an unbroken stream of updates that jumped from topic to topic with no discernible order, and Maya reached over more than once to rest her hand on his knee, grounding him in a way he hadn't let himself be grounded in longer than he wanted to admit. When they finally pulled into the driveway, Caleb sat for a moment with the engine off, looking at the house, the same house he'd left 6 months earlier, the same porch light, the same swing set in the backyard that Claire had insisted on buying before Sophie was even born. "You okay?" Maya asked, watching him. "Yeah," Caleb said. "I'm just remembering what this used to feel like, walking up to that door." "What did it used to feel like?" Caleb thought about it honestly before answering. "Quiet," he said. "Even when Sophie was inside, even when the babysitter had the TV on, it always felt quiet to me, like the important part of the house had gone missing, a long time before I ever left for deployment, and coming home just meant walking back into that same missing piece every single time." "And now?" Maya asked. Caleb looked at his daughter already halfway out of the truck, racing toward the front door, with the particular urgency of a child who couldn't wait one more second to be fully home. He looked at Maya beside him, patient, steady, still there after everything. "Let's find out," he said. He got out of the truck and followed his daughter up the front walk. Maya beside him, and when Sophie threw open the front door and disappeared inside, shouting something about showing him her room, she'd rearranged it while he was gone. Apparently, and needed him to see immediately. Caleb stood on the threshold for one more second, the same threshold he'd crossed 1,000 quiet, heavy times over 7 long years. He opened the door the rest of the way and stepped inside. And this time, he wasn't greeted by silence. He heard laughter first. Sophie's already halfway up the stairs calling down for him to hurry, and then the ordinary sounds of a house that was actually lived in. Actually full. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards under Maya's feet, as she came in behind him and set her keys on the same small dish by the door, where Caleb had started keeping his own months earlier, an unremarkable domestic habit that had somehow become the clearest sign of how much had changed. Maya reached past him and flipped on the kitchen light, and Caleb stood there for a moment, taking it in the crayon drawing Sophie had given him at the airport 6 months ago, now framed and hanging on the kitchen wall where Maya must have put it up while he was gone. A second toothbrush in the bathroom cup that wasn't Claire's faded blue one, though he noticed with a strange, settled kind of peace that the old one was still there too, right beside it, neither one crowding the other out. He hadn't thrown it away. He didn't need to anymore. It didn't feel like a wound sitting in that cup now. It felt like a photograph, a part of the story, instead of a place he was stuck. "You put the drawing up," he said, his voice rough. "Sophie insisted," Maya said. "The day after you left, actually. She said the house needed the sun in it while you were gone." Caleb crossed the kitchen and stood in front of it, studying the crayon strokes he'd carried across an ocean and back, 3 figures holding hands, the sun, oversized and impossible to miss exactly where Sophie had wanted it, right in the middle of everything, watching over the whole house. Sophie thundered back down the stairs a minute later, breathless, already talking before she'd fully entered the room. "Dad, come see. I moved my bed by the window because Maya said the morning light is good for waking up happy instead of grumpy. And it actually works. I've been in a way better mood. Ask her." "I believe you," Caleb said, laughing, letting himself be pulled by the hand toward the stairs, Maya following behind them both. That night, after Sophie had finally worn herself out from 6 months of stored-up updates and fallen asleep with her door open, the way she still liked it, now Caleb found Maya sitting on the back porch steps, looking out at the same yard, the same swing set, the same ordinary shape of a life that had somehow become extraordinary without either of them fully noticing the moment it happened. He sat down beside her. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I've been thinking about how to ask it for about 4 months now, so bear with me if it comes out clumsy." Maya turned to look at him, something careful and hopeful crossing her face. "Okay." Caleb reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. Not one of the old letters, but something new. Something he'd written himself somewhere in the middle of the Pacific on a night when the ship was quiet, and his thoughts had finally settled enough to know exactly what he wanted to say. "I wrote this out here because I didn't trust myself to get the words right if I tried to say them cold," he admitted, unfolding it with hands that were for the first time in longer than he could remember shaking, for a reason that had nothing to do with grief. "Claire's letter told me I was allowed to love again. Sophie's letter told me the same thing before I even knew I needed to hear it. And somewhere out there on that ship, staring at a drawing my daughter made of the 3 of us, I finally understood that being allowed to love you wasn't the hard part anymore. The hard part was figuring out how to tell you that I don't just love you. I want to build the rest of this life with you, all of it. The ordinary Tuesdays and the hard days and everything in between." Maya's hand had come up to cover her mouth, tears already falling freely, and Caleb reached for her other hand, holding it steady in both of his. "Maya Bennett," he said, "will you marry me?" For a moment, she didn't answer, just looked at him with an expression that held 7 months of careful, patient hope, finally breaking loose all at once, and then she was nodding, laughing and crying in the same breath, pulling him into her before the word yes had even finished leaving her mouth. "Yes," she said again, clearer this time, pressed against his chest. "Yes, of course, yes." Behind them, the porch light flickered on, and Caleb turned to find Sophie standing in the doorway, in her pajamas, clearly having crept out of bed the moment she heard voices. Her face lit up with an expression of pure, unguarded delight. "Did you actually ask her?" Sophie demanded. "Right now. Without me?" "I was going to tell you in the morning," Caleb said, laughing. "I've been waiting for this since the day I met her," Sophie announced, marching down the porch steps to insert herself into the middle of the embrace, entirely unbothered by the fact that she'd just interrupted a proposal. "Mom would be so happy right now, I can just tell." "How do you know that?" Caleb asked, laughing through the last of his tears. "Because she said so," Sophie said, simply as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. In her letter. "Remember, be kind to whoever helped Dad come back to life. I think this is what she meant by kind. This is the kind version." Caleb looked at his daughter, this small, endlessly wise girl, who had somehow understood the shape of his grief and his healing better than he had for most of the last 7 years, and felt his chest tighten with a gratitude too large to put into words. Caleb pulled his daughter in against his side. Maya still held close on the other, and looked out at the yard, at the swing set, at the ordinary, unremarkable night that had somehow become the most important one he'd lived through since the day he buried his wife. 7 years earlier, he had stood in this same house and promised himself he would raise his daughter exactly the way he and Claire had once dreamed, and for a long time, he had believed that promise meant standing still, meant refusing to let the rest of his life move forward, while hers had been so cruelly cut short. It had taken a stranger in a restaurant 4 impossible words and 2 letters written by a dying woman with more foresight than Caleb would ever fully understand to teach him the truth Claire had known all along. Keeping his promise had never meant staying frozen in the moment he lost her. It meant living fully enough. Loving fully enough that the daughter they'd raised together would grow up understanding exactly what her mother had always believed, that love was never something you ran out of by giving more of it away. It multiplied. It always multiplied. It had multiplied in a restaurant 3,000 miles from any ocean, in a kitchen where an old toothbrush finally stopped feeling like a wound in a crayon drawing, with a sun too big for the sky in a letter carried faithfully for 8 months, by a woman brave enough to risk being wrong. Caleb Walker had spent 7 years believing that the hardest door he would ever have to open again was the one leading back out into a world that no longer had Claire in it. He understood now that he'd had it backward the entire time. The hardest door, the one that had taken him the longest to open, wasn't the one leading outside at all. It was the one leading back into his own life. The one he'd been standing in front of for 7 long years. Hand on the handle, too afraid to turn it, until a woman he'd never met walked up and said 4 words that finally gave him the courage to push it open. And once he had, he found he never wanted to close it again. Standing on that porch, his daughter tucked against one side and the woman he loved against the other, Caleb Walker finally understood what his wife had been trying to tell him all along, in every letter, in every careful word she'd left behind for the people she loved most. Love doesn't end when a person does. It just finds a new way to keep on living.